All right, Duane, we'll get started here in just a second. Cool. Looks like we're live here. Duane, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it. I haven't seen you in quite some time in person, but I've been on some calls with you, so it's always good to see you.
It is genuinely my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, we got a pretty interesting conversation to kind of dive into today. We're going to step back from some of the policy stuff and maybe investigate a couple different angles. But to start out, kind of want to read something I prepared. We often live our daily lives constantly interacting with others, raising children, asking for help, setting boundaries, sharing opinions, navigating conflict. But we rarely stop to ask the deeper questions that govern those interactions. Yet the reality is, every society operates according to a set of ideas about human nature, power, morality, and the role of government. But those ideas aren't arbitrary. They're shaped by even deeper assumptions about the world, rooted in core beliefs that flow from fundamental questions like, what is the basic human condition? Do individuals own themselves? Is force ever justified? And if so, when? However, there are moments in time when these fundamental questions don't just linger beneath the surface. They demand to be confronted. A tipping point where the things we rarely think about suddenly become impossible to ignore. For many people across America and around the world, I believe the assassination of Charlie Kirk was that moment. That's why in this month's Frontier Briefing, I want to take a step back from the policy and instead explore the core beliefs and principles that quietly shape everything we do. When I set out to have this conversation, the first person who came to my mind was Duane Lester, someone I've had the privilege of learning from and someone who's challenged me to think more deeply about these ideas time and time again. Once again, Duane, thank you for being here.
Thank you. And that's very high praise. I'll do my best to live up to it.
Perfect. Well, we'll have a good conversation about some of these principles. But before talking about like what are property rights and all that, I want to dive a little bit deeper to some of the fundamental questions that really kind of underpin all of the philosophies, the basic kind of truths or debates going on. And one of the first questions I kind of wanted to ask you and get some initial feedback is, what's the base state for humans? Are we, as some have quoted, are brutish and irrational? Other folks say that we're capable of reason and that we're peaceful and in cooperation. There's a lot of different takes in the philosophical world. So curious what your thoughts are, and maybe we continue conversation in that direction for a bit.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, especially from a Christian perspective. You think back to when they called Jesus good in the Bible, and he looked at them like they had two heads. He's like, why would you call me good? There's no good but God. And I look at that and go, I'm pretty sure that I've done a lot worse things than Jesus has. So yeah. Can I call myself good? And, the Bible would tell us that we are flawed. We have flaws. And I think that history bears that out. We have the capacity to do fantastically beautiful things, and we have the capacity to do truly horrific things. And we can only strive to do right by one another while fighting this tendency. Bastiat talked about it in the law. We were just talking about the law. And, he says that we have this tendency that when we can, we will live and prosper at the expense of others. And we see that so often too. And I don't even think about it as just getting our food at the expense of others, but we will do our best to minimize the amount of work that we have to do. And if there aren't systems in place that prohibit that, we'll take advantage of it.
Yeah, certainly. I tend to agree. One thing from Alexander Solzhenitsyn that is one of my favorite quotes of all time, let's see if I can get it right, is the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor classes, nor political parties, but right through every human heart, which I think kind of gets the idea of like, well, if we look at the world, I think we have to acknowledge that we can all do really, really bad things, but we're all capable of really, really great things. And so any political system or moral system that underpins that political system has to have this balancing of reality of like, okay, we could do some really bad things and we can do some really good things. one thing that I often hear that I wanted to ask you about is this kind of mentality that it's what I would call a scarcity mentality. The idea that there's only a finite amount of resources going around, and therefore, if someone has something, it means they've taken it from someone else. Do you have any, thoughts about that?
That it's this there's almost like this fixed pie mentality that if someone is rich, it's because someone else is poor. If someone has money, it's because they took it from someone else. Scarcity is universal. There's scarcity in everything. And we have to recognize that. And that's why, frankly, economics exists, is because scarcity exists. And it's really a getting to understand how that happens. Now, just because one person's rich doesn't mean another person is poor, because the pie isn't fixed in that way. Prosperity creates benefits for everyone. And when you look across the history of economics, the history of the world, you can see that as some people, like in the United States, as we embrace these free market principles, as we embrace natural rights and respect for the dignity of the individual, some have prospered wildly. But even those who are not what we would consider rich in America are still living some of the highest standards of living in the world. I saw someone argue recently that, being middle class in America puts you in the 1% of the planet.
Yep.
And so when you look at it through that perspective, it reminds me of that comedian who says, you think you're living, zoom out. You've got to zoom out from America, and you can see that what we have here is so special because we have the respect for those rights, and we have that system that allows for others to apply their faculties to those raw resources, to the natural resources around them, and create wealth that not only brings them out of poverty, but brings others too.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that one thing that maybe that gives is optimism. This idea that, like, we can improve. And I think a lot of ideologies, especially the ones that are kind of rooted in more of a nihilistic view of the world, have lost that. This idea that, like, no, things will get better, that we can be rationally optimistic. Is everything going to be perfect? Certainly not. But I think that we can continue as people to head in a trajectory of, like, a better life. And that doesn't necessarily mean, like you said, the pie isn't fixed. It is growing. And if the rejection of that, I think is a pretty dangerous place to go.
Yeah. Again, going back to another book we were talking about earlier, Strangers with Candy, the beginning of that talked about how great things are right now, because it said people have this nostalgia for the past. And we see this, we've got to bring manufacturing back to America. Well, frankly, working in a factory back then was not that great. And I remember, he wasn't very popular for saying this at the time, but it was when John McCain was running for president. Say what you want about John McCain, but he nailed this answer. He was talking to a man, I think up in New Hampshire, and this guy said, look, I worked at this plant my whole life. My dad worked at this plant his whole life, and I planned on my son working at this plant his whole life. And, trade is closing it. And McCain looked at him and said, I would hope you'd have higher aspirations for your son.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, because what we want our children to have better lives than we do. And we want them to have those opportunities. I'm not saying anything about the fact that you work in a factory and that it's bad. What I'm saying is this nostalgia for the past is dangerous, because things were not as good in the past as we like to remember them. And the fact of the matter is, even the poor in America are living vastly superior lives than kings used to back in the day. And if you want to argue with that, then go live in a castle with no heat and no air conditioning, no plumbing.
No toilets. Yeah.
Yeah. And tell me, but we have things good and things can get better. The problem is that we have to rely more on liberty and those principles that have allowed us to get to this state. Then on the idea of what Hayek called the fatal conceit, this idea that if I had a friend tell me once, if we could just get the right bureaucrats in place, we can solve all these problems.
Right.
And I was like, that is such a dangerous idea. Millions and millions have died because of that idea.
I think the other interesting thing, to even tie it back to common conversations today on some, very popular TV shows and podcasts and the like, is, well, if we just plug in AI to run the government, then everything will be fixed. And I am not a hater of AI by any means. I think it's really awesome. There's some things we got to figure out with it, but overall, I think it's a great thing. But what that context lacks is the values that underpin it, right? Because if we believe, there's all these different worldviews that are all interacting, and generally people want what's good. It's very rare that people think that what they're doing is actively bad per se. The difference is that we have different kind of core fundamental beliefs, right? My belief is that government is kind of more of a necessary evil than a good in itself. And if we have an AI who has my worldview and that kind of those views, it's gonna lead to much different results. And so just, because we have science, and I love science, and I think it's huge breakthroughs that we've had that are amazing. If we try to be scientific about government, you're still going to have to make decisions about values and virtues and trade-offs.
Yeah, and AI for all of it, it's dependent on the prompts that you put in. It's dependent on how you program it. So you could easily say, "Hey, we'd like you to run our government. Act as if you were Karl Marx." Well,
Yep.
wait, that's the wrong prompt to put in there.
Yeah.
So, but there would be, you go back to being good and being evil and all that. I used to argue in front of classes. I don't know any socialists who sat back and said, if we could do this, we would create a famine that would kill millions. And that's exactly what they want. Most socialists that I know, they don't go do these things because they have an evil heart. They do these things because they basically want the same thing that we do. We want people to live prosperous lives where they have their food that they want, the belt, the houses that they want, the clothes on their backs, their kids to be happy. We just disagree on how to do that.
Yeah.
And so the problem with saying, well, let's just have AI do it, that removes the individuality from it. And it's really dependent on who sets that prompt.
Yeah, I like that, especially because as I've talked to friends, and I think a lot of people are having these conversations now, and I think people are angry on all sides. And, even the last couple of days, we've seen some more political violence that's broken out. And to me, I think it's important that we make clear that, like, at least from my worldview, and I believe yours too, is that I don't think people are necessarily innately evil. Are they capable evil? Absolutely. And so when we talk about things with people, we're debating ideas, which means that we can radically love other people while disagreeing with them. And that's kind of the beauty of what free speech is. Got a lightning storm over here. Classic timing. But I mean, that really is the beauty of free speech, is that we can have those disagreements. And I think that has been a bigger thing. But maybe before we dive into free speech and property rights, I'd ask, maybe unpack a little bit about what made America's founding so unique. Specifically, like, certainly not perfect. We had to have 200 years to start living up to some of our virtues. But one of the things I thought was really unique is that we started a society that believed in radical equality, that we believed all people were equal. Now, like I said, took 200 plus years to actually bring that into a real life place. But maybe unpack that. I know there's a few others that we could go in the direction of as well.
Well, you're right. I mean, they had, I think of the Declaration as like the vision statement. This is where we want to go. And then the Constitution, more of the owner's manual or the employee handbook.
It's a good way to put it.
You got to change this as you move along and make things better. But right there in the Declaration, they talk about the proper role of government. And they talk about rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now we can get into why they chose that and not property, but that's a whole longer conversation. But what's important, and I think people have forgotten, and I think people have especially forgotten today, is that next part, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. And it's this idea that we had rights to start with, and that we have government to protect them, not we have government that gives us these rights, and that's where they come from. It's a completely different mentality, that we as individuals have a dignity, and that dignity comes from our individual rights and the right to apply our faculties to the raw resources of the world and create prosperity. And it was more than just setting out this Constitution. And this was something I can't remember what book I was reading it. Oh, The History of Capitalism. I just finished that book the other day, and he was talking about the fact that you have to have a mental model around capitalism, that capitalism actually comes from a spontaneous order. It isn't something that you can just say, we have capitalism now, go get them. Because we've seen people try that with collectivism. We saw that in the Soviet Union. We saw that in China. Here's what we're doing now, and then watch the tragedies that come from that. What we got here in America is a spontaneous order of beliefs around individual liberty that have benefited all of us. Even today, where we see more and more of what Bastiat would call socialism, legal plunder in America, we still have a higher standard of living than places that don't have our economic freedom, don't have our respect for property rights or individual liberty.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good illustration of those underlying, there's kind of like our day-to-day operations, and then there are, I think, ideas about the world, and then there's like core fundamental beliefs, and that is, the dignity of humans. And I think that's baked into our system in America. I think that the dignity, not just the dignity of humans, but the innate worth of them, that humans are worthwhile for the sake of humans being worthwhile. It's not that they do anything to achieve it. It's that, no, life is incredibly valuable. And I think it's something that, especially in America, we, and I think a lot of places as well too, but I think that we've tried to kind of lay out a foundation, like you said, a vision statement of like, no, we believe people are valuable. Like you said, the owner's manual, I really like that too, of the operationalizing it. One thing, maybe would you kind of unpack, I guess, what spontaneous order is? Where does that come from? How does that apply? Is there a mental model that we can use to think about this?
So when I think about spontaneous order, I automatically go back to iPencil. And I think iPencil is the best way to illustrate that. So I don't have any pencils right here. I guess I've got markers and pens, but I know out in my vehicle, I've got a pencil. And there's not one person on this planet who knows how to make that pencil. Not one person. But there are people who know how to cut down trees. Now, that person couldn't cut down that tree. I mean, I suppose they could with a rock. They could just pick up a rock and try to cut down a tree, but you've got to have an axe or a saw or a chainsaw. But that person who's cutting down the tree doesn't know how to mine the ore. They don't know how to refine that ore into a metal they then shape into an axe. But all these things happen. And the breakfast that was on that logger's table that morning, that wasn't planned. There were people who were all acting in their own self-interest, and because of their actions in their own self-interest, we see things that are organized in ways that couldn't possibly be organized by a set of bureaucrats who are benevolent and want the best for all of us. They simply couldn't do it. And Hayek talked about this in the use of knowledge in society. There's so much out there that we don't even realize goes on, that there's no way we could organize it. I mean, I live in the northwest corner of Missouri, and there's a Starbucks 40 miles from here that tomorrow will have the coffee that they need for that town of I don't know, is it 14,000 or is college back in and now it's up to 25,000? But they will have it because there are people out there acting in their own self-interest, and this spontaneous order that is created benefits everyone.
I think the cool thing about that is it's extremely distributed. It's a very empowering pro-human thing that we all have our own kind of specialties, right? And going to the example about iPencil is that, like, I'm really good with a chainsaw, don't mean to brag, but I'm good with a chainsaw. If you ask me to do more than change small parts on it, I'm gonna be lost. So I take it to somewhere else to use.
Right. You can't go and make the bar oil that you need to lubricate that chain.
Right. And so as we have more people working together and to accomplish something, we have more complex systems, more complex tools, more complex relations. And the cool thing is that there's not one person dictating it all. There's not like a guy at top who's going, you do this and you do this. I mean, the Soviet Union, they tried that. It didn't work,
And nor do we want one. We don't want. Imagine when you go to school and you're said, Tanner, your job now is that you're going to be a farmer. And I don't want to be a farmer. I don't like the outdoors. I want to be a librarian. Well, we've got enough librarians, but we don't have enough farmers. So you're now a farmer. We don't want people organizing that.
Yeah.
And when you see these things, like a great story from the Soviet Union where they were organizing everything, they wanted a certain number, they wanted a certain tonnage of bolts. So what do you do when you get this order from Moscow? Oh, we need a certain tonnage of bolts. You start manufacturing the biggest bolts that you can. So because you don't have price signals telling you we actually need this size of bolts, you're manufacturing all the biggest bolts you can because what you need is tonnage, not what a specific person somewhere needs. And so they had a surplus of huge bolts and they had a shortage of the bolts they actually needed.
That's so interesting. Well, one example that I wanted to say, I think this is very much spontaneous order and kind of working together without someone orchestrating everything, is what I think is fundamental to what is the human experience is, essentially. I'm not sure if you've heard of, I believe it's Utsi. It's the Utsi, the Iceman. This is from 3,300 years ago. Was someone that a man that froze in the Alps. And the interesting thing in the connection here is that they went through his toolkit. And he had, I believe, 30 different types of tools. He had a copper axe. I believe he had beads from the coastline. He's in the Alps. He's not close to the coastline. It was probably from Africa. And so someone went through and kind of did all of the math. And it is, next to 0% chance that he manufactured all of those. It's 3,300 years ago. The fundamental reality of humanity is scarcity, that you can't have everything you want, but that there is, desires. I have things that I want. Back then a copper axe would be amazing. And so you trade for it, which kind of brings me into maybe the next point I want to explore, which is humans interacting. This is this cooperation, we've talked a little bit with spontaneous order. People are kind of working together without, directions. But one really important thing to remember with cooperation, and remember that it's not a fixed pie, is this idea of mutual benefit. Could you maybe unpack what mutual benefit is, maybe where some misconceptions of that, or if you have a lack of understanding of what mutual benefit is, like maybe some of the consequences that would go to?
No, this is a very important point, and one that I remember when I first learned it. Believe it or not, I was in a interview where I was in a competition to be the defender of capitalism, right? And I was in this program called the Leadership Program of the Rockies. And earlier in the year, we had Yaron Brook in there talking about capitalism, and they brought up, if a person gives somebody $5 for an orange, what does that mean? And they explained, well, it means that they valued the orange more than $5. And that person who owned the orange valued $5 more than the orange. So just through that simple, and I'm making those numbers up.
Right.
Let's say you know, at that point, when you have this mutual benefit, so Tanner, you have an orange, I have $5. You want my $5 because you can take that $5 and turn it into something else. I want that orange because oranges are delicious and I'm hungry. The value has now increased for both of us because you now have more value than you had before because you valued the $5 more. I clearly valued the orange more. So again, we go back to the pie isn't fixed. Value has been created. And that's the whole point of it, is through mutual benefit, you have value creation. When you have coercion involved, you're actually destroying value because resources are not going to where they're most needed. And because of that, you have value destruction.
Yeah. It kind of going to you reminded me of a pretty common story, actually. I think obviously I live in Montana and I'm a sucker for some of these historical stories. And one of the common ones that gets shared is in, the pioneer days, during Christmas or in other holidays, someone would come to town with oranges, and sometimes it would be candy. And I think Little House on the Prairie has even talked about this, and I think some other books as well too. But it was awesome. It was a delicacy. Like, people were ecstatic to get an orange because it was so incredibly rare. And so they would be willing to part with quite a bit of money, especially back then, to get an orange. And but that same orange in Florida was pennies. And so I think that it just demonstrates that there can be mutual benefit. Just because you are trading someone doesn't mean that it's theft or you're stealing or anything like that. And I think that's one of the core misconceptions of free markets that is around, that this idea that I'm not forcing you to trade with me. And that's kind of one of the core things.
Yeah. And the trade won't happen unless there's mutual benefit, because both of us can walk away. I'm not giving you $5 for an orange. That's crazy. There's a guy selling oranges around the corner. Well, how about $2? Okay. Now we have mutual benefit.
Well, and that's one of the cool things, I think, going into the next topic would be that applies actually to, especially in a free society, right? Where there isn't a hierarchy of people based on, whether you're a king or a lord or something like that. I can say no. Like, do I want to do business with this person? That's kind of what maybe would say like freedom of association. And maybe let's go back and unpack one other core thing that's fundamental to free markets and free people, which is property rights. You want to maybe give a little background there?
Well, when you think about property, what's the first? I think about Walter Williams, and there one of the things he asked that I used a lot in my training when we started talking about the proper role of government was, who owns you? And when I'd ask this question in trainings, I'd often get, well, God owns me. And I'd be like, okay, but he's renting you out to who? And you have property in your own person. And so if you have property in your own person, is it safe to say then that you have property in your own thoughts, your own actions? And if you can take your thoughts and your actions and you can apply it to resources in the world, for example, let's say there's a tree and that tree has fruit on it, and you pick that fruit and it's no one's tree. It's not like, hey, this is Tanner's tree and I'm stealing his apples, but there's a tree. I can take the apples. I turn that apple into an apple pie. Now that apple pie, having applied my own thought, my own person, my actions to the natural resources of the world, the raw materials, I now have a pie. Therefore, the property is mine. Now, can I take that pie and trade it to you for something that you have, maybe a copper axe? Here's the first installment of apple pies that I'll give you over the next, I don't know, week or so. Now we can trade because we have that property. Now, when property is violated, then you have all bets are off. Life and liberty is out the window.
That's one thing that it's core to what Frontier Institute does, and I think a lot of other organizations too, is we fight for property rights. And I get this question a lot, like, why property rights? Why are you choosing that one? And it's because you hit it right on the head. Property rights mean that you own yourself, that You are, at the end of the day, you know, there's kind of going to the psychology side of things. The only thing I can control is my own thoughts and actions. I can't control anybody else's, which means that I have ownership over myself. And if I have ownership, I have property in myself. And so, yeah, like when I mix it with, you know, a labor and my thoughts and creativity, then property is created. What would you say to some of the critiques I've heard of property rights, that this is a construct that's used to divide people? There's been a lot of critiques over the years, but that's a common one I still hear to this day.
Well, my first thought when I hear that's a construct, I channel my inner Dick Cheney and I think, so what? Does that mean it's wrong? So let's assume the premise it is a construct. So what? Is it a wrong construct then? Is it wrong to say I have property in my person and therefore property in the fruits of my labor? Does that mean it's wrong? Or is it more likely, knowing that we have this human tendency to want to live at the expense of others, that we will freely live at the expense of others, to realize that there are people out there more than willing to take my property if it benefits them, and that that benefit might be votes in the next election, it might be not having to go get a job. But what does that do then to my motivation? When I start seeing that my property is not secure, when I start seeing that there are people out there who are more than willing to use force in efforts of just what Bastiat called stupid greed or false philanthropy, when there are people out there who are willing to point guns at me and say, give me a portion of your property so that I can keep it myself, or that I can give it to this other person so that will benefit me later, I am no longer as motivated as I used to be to produce. And now you're going to see production go down. You see this everywhere. There's a great story out of China that during Mao's reign, there was a farming collective. He had these farming collectives all over. And one thing they did was generate hungry people on these farms. And this farm itself, they'd starved for so long, they got together and they said, look, we're gonna give everybody little pieces of property. And if this gets out, we're dead. You all know this. We will be dead if this gets out. But Tanner, you've got this piece of property. You can grow whatever you want on there. Whatever in excess of what we have to give to Mao, you can keep. You can keep it. And when they did that, they grew so much food on that one collective that they noticed that they came in and said, okay, what's going on here? And why are you growing so much? And that's when you started seeing China move more towards free market capitalism like they have today than they did back then. I think it was Deng Xiaoping, I might be saying his name wrong, but he came in and he said, look, I don't care what they're doing over there. They're growing food. Let them go. And that goes back to that spontaneous order, that he didn't come in and say, you guys are all going to do this now. They were already doing it. And he said, okay, it's working. Let it go. In fact, let's create a little special economic zone here where they can do the same thing on a much grander scale. Wow, that worked incredibly well. Let's make all kinds of special economic zones. And now you see what they have there today.
That's really interesting. I hadn't heard that before. But I think it's a good illustration of, you know, I kind of think the same way when someone says that, like, oh, property rights is just a construct. It's really like, maybe, but it arises everywhere in the world as a response to problems. You know, if I go and I spend all day picking these apples, can you come and take these apples from me now? You know, and someone might say, well, yeah, it's like not actually your tree. No one planted that tree, so of course I can just come and take these from you. But then next thing you know, you have a community that's decided, no, we're not going to play by those rules. We're going to set up clear property rights. And what we've seen over time is them getting more and more and more clear. And in the places in which they don't have clear property rights and they don't fight for the ability to own yourself and to merge your labor and your thinking into something that you own, has serious consequences.
We've seen it time and time again. throughout. There's been so many experiments. You can look at experiments right now between North and South Korea.
Mm-hmm.
You can look you go back a little bit in time, East and West Germany. You can see these experiments where property rights were respected and property rights were abolished. Which system would you rather live under? Everyone, well, I won't say everyone. Most people, most rational people would say, I choose the one with food.
Yep. The place that works.
Yes.
So what's your kind of view on not just property rights, maybe an aspect of property rights, but this would be like freedom of thought, freedom of speech. Do you see these as overlapping or similar ideas?
I like what Frederick Douglass said about freedom of speech. He's like, when you keep someone from speaking, you're violating the rights of two people. You're violating the rights of the person who should be able to speak, but you're also at the same time violating the rights of the person who should be allowed to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And when you don't allow that freedom of speech, what you find is you find terrible things happening. You can see instances, again, go back in history, when you see poor old Galileo, who's sitting there saying, actually, I think maybe the earth revolves around the sun. No, you can't say that. And that's one instance. But then you go back, there's a story out of the Soviet Union where there was their Secretary of Agriculture back then. And he said, you know what, I don't think that genetics are a thing. I think actually we're going to follow my made up pseudoscience, and that's how we're going to grow our crops. And nobody was allowed to say anything in opposition to that, because you don't go against what Moscow says. And so again, because there was no freedom of speech, there was no one allowed to say, that's a bad idea, you're going to get people hurt. They just let it go, and millions of people starved. So you've got to have this free sharing of ideas. And I go back to, again, John Stuart Mill in On Liberty talked about that there are 3 reasons why you should let people talk. One, what they're saying might actually be true. I know it's weird, but what they're saying might actually be true, and people need to hear that. You don't rob humanity of the truth. The second one is it might only be partly true, and there's a kernel of truth in there. So you want to hear that, but you also want to show where they're wrong. And the third, even if it's false, you need that out there to sharpen the iron of the truth, to say, actually, that's not right. Here's what this is. And without that, all you get are people who are saying, genetics isn't a real thing in crops. We're just going to do this.
That was one of my core things actually that got me into politics, was free speech. I was going to Montana State, and we had not terrible policies, but not the best policies. We'd have a little free speech zone for a while, and quite a few things around there. But it's so true. Like what we've seen the last few years with quote unquote hate speech. And I think there is gross speech. I think that there are some really horrible things that get said. Like, there's no denying that. But what we allow, and we have all ideas be able to discuss, it provides a bellwether. Like, where is culture at? Where are we at? And I can push back, because there are some bad ideas. There are some really good ideas. But the last thing I would say for that is, if we don't allow people to speak, I think that it's really easy for us to think that we're fighting people instead of ideas.
I would like to know who the racists are.
I think it's fair.
I just, I would want to know. And I think we don't want to get in a situation where we're allowing these angels in the government to decide what's hate speech. And to give you an idea, I could find it very easy, if I were willing to, say that mocking the assassination of Charlie Kirk is hate speech, and anyone engaged in it should have repercussions. I don't want that. I think that whole thing is abhorrent. Mm-hmm. I look at it and say, didn't realize this is how bad it was. But I want to know who that is, and I want to know who they are, and I want to know that's out there. If that is suppressed, you're not changing anyone's mind.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't change anyone's mind if I don't know that they hold those views. So in order for me to move the country back towards one of liberty, I have to know that those people have contrary ideas. And I have to be able to control myself then too. And that's something that I've talked to people a lot about recently in some of the trainings that I did. I'll tell you, Tanner, what I have them do is I say, write down an idea that you completely disagree with. And so they'll write something down and I'll say, now give it to someone else in the room. And so they trade. And I say, now, whatever note you were giving, you have to convince the person who gave it to you that that is the right way that it should be done. Right. So they look at their note and, 99 times out of 100, they don't agree with what's on that note either. Right. So now I've got to convince this person who I know disagrees with this, something that I disagree with also. And the whole point of it isn't to get that person to convince the other person. It's to engage a physiological response in them. And what happens is when we as people, we experience something we disagree with, we have what's called an amygdala alert in our brain. And that's the same part of our brain that engages fight or flight. So when you hear an idea you don't like, your brain automatically says, okay, do we need to run from this or do we need to attack it?
Yeah. And
so when you start realizing that's what goes on in all of us, it helps you better prepare to talk to somebody who disagrees with your idea, because you can be a little more patient with them as they work through their own fight or flight. And I recommend doing it in person. Don't try and do it online.
Yeah.
It won't work.
Yeah. I agree. It's especially the online thing. I try to limit the amount of time online too. But I think also, I'm all for, a lot of our founding fathers wrote anonymously. And so I'm not for saying you can't say things anonymously. But for a good society, man, for the sake of, I'll put it this way. I don't talk to my friends who I disagree with over text about things we disagree with. I would never do that.
It's a good policy.
I always in person, and we talk about things, and there is plenty to disagree with. But it's because I don't want things to be misunderstood, and I want to be able to talk to them like a human being. And I think that's where you get lost, especially when it gets online. Well, my next question here, you mentioned it, and it's another core idea that Frontier Institute, as well as many other groups that are on the right, especially, and some a little bit on the left too, but operate on is a core belief in liberty. Would you unpack what that is exactly, and what are the confines of that? What does it mean?
I think Matt Kibbe summed it up really well, is don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. And so when you live in the world, you should have the free reign to seek your own enlightenment, your own fulfillment, your own self-actualization, as long as you are not violating the natural rights of life, liberty, and property of someone else. So when you have liberty, you're free to choose your own path, as long as you're not hurting someone else in some way. And that's essentially what it comes down to, is seeking our own self-actualization, our own fulfillment, without hurting other people.
That's beautifully said, and I appreciate that. So it's maybe having these other principles, like the dignity of others, and the kind of radical equality of, like, we're all, fundamentally going to agree that we're all equally worthwhile, and property rights. And I think there's a few others that we could probably chat about too. Those are maybe operationalized, is kind of how I feel it through liberty, is like having those creates a place in which we can foster freedom. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, you've got things out there. We've talked about self-ownership, property rights, but you've got to have things like the rule of law too. And that you start looking at liberty. If someone else has the right to take your stuff and there's no problem with that, but you are treated differently, you're not going to have the same liberties. You're not going to have the same success. And it all comes back to, are you hurting someone? Are you engaging in what Bastiat would call legalized plunder? Are you able to hurt someone with impunity and have nothing happen to you? That's not an exercise of liberty. That's actually an injustice and shouldn't be allowed.
What would you say? So kind of moving up a step here. So rule of law is also really a basic one, principle that we should have. And I think it was actually something that probably took a lot of trial and error to realize, oh no, if you go before the law, you have to be seen equally. You can't be seen differently. And I think that was, quite frankly, probably thousands of years of people feeling like, oh, that's not okay. When they go talk to the guys in charge, they get treated well. But when I talk to them, it doesn't go very well. So it's another core kind of principle there. But here's the underlying kind of ideas that we're kind of chatting about too. I want to take it up a level, which to me would be kind of the reality of the world that we're in. How do we operationalize these? And one of those key questions is, what is the role of government?
Well, it's right there in the Declaration. It's to secure and defend the rights of the individual, and what comes with that. So, do we need courts in order to uphold contracts? Okay, well, they're the rights of the individual. We should have something like that, a justice system, that sort of thing. But when you look at the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, endowed with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and property, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So government exists to secure and defend rights. Now, it didn't say after that, oh, and if they need, healthcare, we should also pay for their doctors. It doesn't say that it doesn't say anything other than that. Secure and defend the rights of the individual. That's the proper role of government. When you get outside of that, it's difficult to call it anything other than injustice when you're using the force of government, coercion, to start engaging in the redistribution of wealth, the redistribution of property, the violation of property rights. You start engaging in injustice, it's impossible to have justice.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you too. One critique that I'd like to hear your feedback on, and this is, I think it's actually a pretty common in America to this day to hear folks say this, and that is that, well, government is just people coming together to do things, and that's kind of how I would view like nonprofits and like corporations, of like people coming together. Is it true, or is government just people coming together, or is it something fundamentally different?
No, government is people coming together. Now, here's the caveat on that. We come together with government in order to secure and defend rights. So the four questions that I would ask, and I hope I can remember all four of them now, is I would say, where does a just government get its power? A just government gets its power from the people. Okay, can a person give away something they don't have? No. Does that include authority? Like, can I say, if you're watching this live stream, you can have the plant behind Tanner? No, I don't own that. I don't have that authority. So it follows then that I can only give away power or authority that I have. Mm-hmm. So when can I use violence? I can use it in defense of my rights or in defense of the rights of another. Can I use violence to take property from someone else and give it to another person? No. So a just government gets its power from the people. People can't give away that which they don't have. So government only has the power to secure and defend rights. That's when it can use violence, in no other way. Now, just because people voted on it doesn't mean that it magically gets powers. Yeah. It doesn't work like that. So government is people coming together, but it's people coming together to create an entity that secures and defend rights in the same way that we can. And that's it. That's the way I see it anyway. That's the way Bastiat talked about it in the law. And I just happen to agree with that. Now, if you want more people to get together and do things, I can tell you that what I've seen in trying to alleviate poverty, you will have more success in working in nonprofits and working with mutual aid than you ever will by using coercion and violence to redistribute wealth. It just works better. There's someone in Joplin I just met the other day. He runs an organization called True Charity. Last year, they took 107 people in Joplin out of poverty, and they don't accept government funding because government funding comes with government strings. And they said, the way we do it is the way they used to do it. And they say, well, you can have this, but you gotta work for it.
Yeah. Well, and I think that the other aspect here, which I always go back to, is, well, it's kind of comes to the definition of like, what is the state per se? And to me, I think it's getting a little bit, philosophical per se, but, government is the monopoly of force within a given area. And there's necessarily really, really negative consequences that can come from that. And it can be a really slippery slope. For instance, going to the, donating and bringing people out of poverty that's a really awesome thing to do. And I think that we would all very much be for that, but it has to come from me being willing, consenting to give that up. And a nonprofit can't come to me with a gun and say, you have to do this. And that's what makes it, I think, good, actually. Now, if someone robbed me on the street and said, you have to give to X, it doesn't make it morally right by any means. It actually makes it morally bankrupt. It makes it wrong even. And I think there's a fundamental difference there of when we choose to have solutions outside of government, sometimes they're harder, but they're always better. I mean, there's very, very rare occasions in which government can do something better. And I think it's to what you've pointed out, and that is to secure fundamental rights. After that, all of the little things that they do can and should be done by the free market.
Yeah, that reminds me of the third question that I'd always ask them was, does a majority vote make something wrong, something right? And they'd say, no. That was usually the most aggressive no that I'd get. No, it doesn't. You're like, okay. And then the last one, of course, was who owns you? And what's funny is I would ask that when I was talking, it was a very philosophical training. And I'd always start by saying, okay, show of hands, any libertarians in here? And some hands might go up and say, any conservatives? A bunch of hands would go up. Any liberals? No hands. Any progressives? No. Any collectivists? Any socialists? No hands. And I just look at them and I go, all right, we'll see. And then later on, they'd start advocating for something like a redistribution of wealth in some way. And I'd be like, hold on a second. Why'd you say you weren't collectivist? Why'd you say you weren't socialist? Because what you're talking about here is X. And then we get into a much more entertaining conversation.
Right. And that kind of maybe is the last thing I wanted to just chat about is there's this kind of idea of just a splash of socialism or a splash of redistribution, and just government stepping outside of its bounds for one thing. Not so bad, right?
Just a little bit of injustice.
Just a little bit. And thoughts there?
Well, I think we've talked about it. We will easily and happily live at the expense of someone else. And what we don't see is the cost of that long term. We want to do this. We want to help someone. Look, this is for the greater good. Okay. What we're doing here is to help someone. And Thomas Sowell talks about this in Applied Economics. He says, you got to look past step one. And he tells a story of when he used to be a Marxist. He was a Marxist in college, and he was asked, well, what got you out of that? And he said, facts. And as he tried to apply these things, he had a professor who'd bring this Marxist policy to him, and the professor would look at it and say, okay, great. Okay. And then what happens? And Sowell would be like, what do you mean? He says, well, you put this in place, and then what happens? Come back and tell me that. And he'd come back and he'd be like, okay, we did this. So now this is this. And he goes, okay, cool. Then what happens?
Yep.
And then he'd come back. And he said, by the time I got to the end of it, I realized that this would never, ever work, that it consistently led to bad outcomes. Mm-hmm. And so what we see today, so often, just take a look at all the bills that are being passed and ask yourself, how many of these bills are we seeing to fix problems that we didn't predict in the last time we passed a bill to help someone?
Yep.
And this goes back to what is seen and not seen. Any policy that you put out there is going to have very obvious and seen consequences. And then there's going to be the things that you never even saw coming, the unseen consequences. And then you're going to have to deal with those. And the problem is, Soul talked about this in another book. I think it was a Vision of the Anointed. He said there will always be someone out there who sees a crisis, and in that crisis they have the solution for it.
Mm-hmm.
And the most important thing I ever learned from Thomas Sowell is there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And so he says, okay, so they bring the solution out, and then there's all these people that are saying that's a bad idea, you shouldn't do that, that's going to cause a lot of problems, and here's the problems it's going to cause, and those get dismissed. We'll just poo-poo those, that'll never happen. Yep. So anyway, they put the policy in place, and then all those bad things happen, and then what you get is, well, imagine how bad it'd be if we did nothing. Now let's fix these problems we created.
Yep.
And so it's really a realization that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And if you want to help someone, the best way to do it is through these voluntary associations that we saw when America started. Tocqueville talked about this in Democracy in America. He said, where you see the French government taking action, where you see the British government taking action, in America you see associations forming. And we used to have a huge variety of associations. And what we've seen government say, oh, we could do that. Oh, we could do that. Oh, we could do that. And it's gotten to the point where you'll see people start nonprofits, and the whole goal of the nonprofit is to eventually turn it into a government agency to take care of. And we wonder why we don't have strong communities anymore. We wonder why the neighbors don't know one another. We wonder why the churches are getting more and more empty, because we keep turning to government to solve all our problems. And the institutions of community and civil society, they've atrophied to the point where when we see a problem, we say, I pay my taxes, government should take care of that. So you've got to look at the long-term effects of this alleged goodwill that you're doing. It's false philanthropy, and it will do far more harm than good.
Yeah, I mean, the road to hell is paved in good intentions. It's not always about the intentions. And last concluding, I think anecdotal little story is, we're about 100 years ago, almost, there's folks heading west, and they were coming out, from New York or Boston to Montana and Colorado and areas, and they get out here and they want to buy a piece of land, or they need a place to stay. They don't know anyone. They're small towns. And so a lot of people got taken advantage of. And so the spontaneous order free market solution to this actually was to build trusted institutions. And they weren't government by any means. What happened is you had civil societies that were, if you're coming from New York, you join, any number of fraternal organizations, build relationships, and then head out west and go to your local community where they're at. And, there's fraternal, whether it's the Masons or really you name it. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of them. You'd find them and you'd say, okay, I can trust these people. I know these people are trusted because they're in kind of the network where we're building trust. We know people. I can trust that they will point me in the right direction of where can I go buy land, what's good advice? What's bad advice? Am I going to get robbed if I go over there? And that just, I think, to me, demonstrates that, especially out west, we have a history of radical solutions that are so successful when we let government get out of the way. And I think that's kind of our important first step.
Yeah, there's a great book called The Not So Wild Wild West. I don't know if you've ever heard of it or not, but it's a great book. And it helped me realize, going back to that spontaneous order we've talked about. So everything's going on out west, and the federal government's like, what are we going to do with these folks? We're making states out here, but we don't know what to do with them. And they just said, well, what are they doing already? And they said, well, they've created all these institutions. Like, well, just do that. You don't need to remake the wheel. They've already got it working. Just institutionalize what they're doing. And so there was so much of what happened in society spontaneously, where people came together and say, we trust this. And that became how we then started governing. And I don't know if people realize that, but
it's that spontaneous order of capitalism that I think is its strength, because it isn't imposed on us. We agree with it, we see it, we grow in it, and then we see, yeah, that it does work.
Mm-hmm. Well, Duane, I really appreciate your time. We're getting close to our end here. Do you have a Substack, or where can people read anything if you write? How can they get a hold of you if they'd like?
Most of my writing these days has to be more involved with actual adult learning and training, but look for me soon. I will probably start doing a little bit more in the political realm online, say approximately November 3rd.
All right. Fair enough, Duane. Well, hey, thank you so much. Thanks for all your insights and words of wisdom. You have a great one.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.